alcune cose, ma poi devo partire fra un secondo, quindi 30 secondi perché siamo per partire.
Hello, Janet.
Howdy.
Good, how are you?
Tell me your mom knows the world.
What kind of world do I want to live in? I think about this question a lot.
For our generation and for specifically my group of people, which is refugees, the circumstances might dismantle any vision of the future that we have.
You're trying to rebuild, you're trying to make a future for yourself, and then the climate-related disaster comes and you start again. It's not about how it's affecting you now, it's about how it's affecting you your entire life.
First step to understand is that we're all a part of it. None of us are going to be left out by the crisis.
We're at a stage where if we don't act now, really there won't be very much left.
There are generations that will never see certain things that we grew up seeing in real life.
We have to start treating this like the emergency it is. To achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have to go from an intention to a serious commitment.
Business leaders really need to rethink how they conduct their business and invest in creating systems that are climate friendly.
The action I would like to see is accountability. Structures being put in place where countries aren't just asked to do something, but they're kept accountable to the decisions that they make.
There has to be that strong collaboration between government, between corporations, between youth activists to drive change forward.
The world I would want to live in is a world where imagining the future is not a privilege.
I want to live in a world where people do not give up on hope that a positive change is possible.
The fact that you're listening today means that you are willing to make a change.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, based on where you're based on the world, and welcome to this session, to our dialogue on the 15-minute city. My name is Carlo Ratti, I'm professor at MIT, where I run a lab called Sensible City Lab, and today we'll talk about the 15-minute city together with Sally Capp, Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne in Australia, with Matt Haig, Chair of the Executive Board at Mott MacDonald Group in the UK, and with Arunabha Ghosh, who's founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India. So just to begin, let's take a few minutes to talk about the 15-minute city. Well, the 15-minute city has been talked about a lot over the past couple of years, especially in circles dealing with planning, with urban planning, with cities, in government. Like many things, many reputable things in the world, it has a French origin and name. La Ville du Quart d'Heure, and actually was theorized by Carlos Moreno and Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, over the past couple of years, especially during the pandemic, when we all hoped that our city were a bit closer to us. A 15-minute city is based on the idea that we can build neighborhoods where everything we need, or most of the things we need in our lives, can be reached very quickly. You can describe it as an isochron. An isochron is an area that you can reach within, as the name says, within 15 minutes in this case. And so you can think about the city as kind of a fractal organism where you've got different neighborhoods, 50-minute neighborhoods that together piece together a bigger city as a fractal, again, in a fractal way. Now, the 50-minute city has been discussed a lot. It's been followed in many cities. It is a principle. It's been now followed in many planning initiatives around the planet. Recently, we've also seen a few more critical voices about the 50-minute city, about the challenges. Clearly, if you were to do a merely 15-minute city, so if people were not to go out of the 15-minute bubble, we could also increase segregation, or somehow, a 15-minute city would become then the equivalent of a village. The city itself is also the richness that happens beyond the 15 minutes. Having said that, that's just as a simple framing for the concept. Really, I wanted to start by asking Sally, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, as I said. Sally, your city, first of all, is usually in the top ranking globally in terms of quality of life. And your city has been promoting over the years a concept quite similar to the 15-minute city. Looking at 20-minute neighborhoods, and again, similar principles of what we're discussing today. So perhaps could you elaborate on that, and how do you see that your approach to planning over the past 20, 30 years in Melbourne has helped make it more livable?
Thanks, Carlo. It's an honour to join you on this panel today and to talk about 15-minute cities. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from today. We are proud that Melbourne has had a long history of being recognised as one of the most livable cities in the world, but it's not something that we've achieved by chance. In fact, 3 decades ago, we were described as a moribund city in a rust bucket state. Since then, we've been very thoughtful and deliberate about the way that we design our city spaces to drive aspirational economic, social and environmental outcomes for our community. There are a number of very intentional factors that contribute to this. We are devotees of mixed-use communities and planning schemes that support the co-location of work, live and play, and that underpins our 20-minute city. We do prioritise active and public transport infrastructure so that people can easily walk or catch public transport to the services they need to work and, of course, to recreation. And we note that about 90% of the trips done around our CBD are done by foot. We cherish unique local character and really do our best to make sure that we've promoted local economies and support them to flourish. We foster opportunities for people of all ages, backgrounds and abilities to be able to connect and engage, which is one of the reasons why we're renowned as a festival and event city as well. And we like to plot adaptability and sustainability into every decision we make so that our city and our people are ready to meet current and future challenges. We remain committed, Carlo, to measuring ourselves against the global standards, and we were the first city in Australia to pledge to report our progress against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I was dismayed to read from the World Economic Forum that in 2020, the first year in a long time that we've seen a backward step in the achievement of the SDGs. And we know that the COVID crisis has impacted many cities and their ability to keep driving those goals forward. But we want to use the crisis, as many do, as a catalyst to improving the adaptability of our city by going to the next level and planning for each of our neighbourhoods to be very distinctive in their 20-minute identity. Over the past year, we've made great strides in cementing our reputation as a livable city. One more minute, Carlo. We've fast-tracked the delivery of 44 kilometres of protected bicycle lanes. We've endorsed an affordable housing strategy and set up an entity to make sure we have more affordable housing, particularly for key workers. And we're turning our Yarra waterfront into a lush and lively public realm, 4 kilometres of new public open space, and we're using our urban forest strategy to increase our canopy cover. All of those things are elements of what we are doing to maintain our livable status, but also to enshrine our 20-minute status. And we believe it's now more important than ever that we create connected, cohesive cities full of possibility. Thank you, Carlo.
Thank you very much, Sally. And what you said, especially the mixed-use developments to combine different functions in the neighborhood is vital if you want to have neighborhoods where within a 15-minute walk or bike ride we can reach most of the things we need in life.
And homogeneous is boring, Carlo. Anyway.
Absolutely, and also when you mix things, that allows you to use much better space as well, because things compensate over time. So it allows you to schedule better the city, and that's one of the things I always admire in Melbourne, how rich and always present urban life, public life is. But going from Melbourne, I wanted to ask Mike. Mike, with your company, you're consulting with governments, especially city governments globally. So how do you see this idea being developed and being used by cities in different parts of the planet?
Yeah, no, good question. I think the answer to that in some ways would have been different 18 months ago. I do think that COVID has made a difference. People talk about pandemics as being great accelerators of trends that were already happening. And if you think of the climate emergency, if you think of social outcomes as a response to inequality, these things have all accelerated, I think, in the last 18 months. So that's good, because I think there's a driver. I think there's a very clear driver around 15-minute cities. We're seeing social outcomes coming to the fore in our clients' thinking, kind of all over the place. And and it's not always about the cities per se. It might be about improving resilience to physical impacts of climate change, that we're seeing across the globe in Southeast Asia, for example. Providing rapid public transport to less advantaged communities in places like Los Angeles. So I could give the list kind of goes on, but this social change thing, I think, is acting as a driver. I do think it's pretty clear that developing 15-minute cities requires a really deep and broad understanding of the sort of transformations that might be maybe required, and that's not straightforward. It's complex, and certainly in our role as planners and engineers, making these transformations real really requires an in-depth understanding. And I do think, and I'll touch on data in a minute as well, but I think data is part of this, trying to make sense of that complexity. We've got a great advantage nowadays with digital technology to be able to use data to make sense of what's going on. Sally already talked about the merits of 15-minute cities, and I guess they're clear and they're well rehearsed. And of course, there's the big environmental and health benefits that they bring as well. But there are challenges, and Carlos, you touched on this. Carlo, you touched on this. There are real challenges. I think recognizing that local differences are fundamental is really important, and those differences from city to city, from country to country, but also within a city, there isn't a 15-minute city kind of blueprint that will work everywhere, and so we really need to make sure that we treat each city, each neighborhood, each community in a different way. I think as we've been involved in this, there are some, despite the differences, there are some really important, useful kind of common goals. And again, I think these came out in the discussion about Melbourne. But I think firstly, livable and sustainable cities need to promote equality of access and opportunity from people from different sections of society. Maybe that's obvious, but it's not always easy to do. I think secondly, You know, the pandemic has definitely highlighted the importance of building kind of social resilience around those social inequalities. And thirdly, I already mentioned the climate emergency and the demands, you know, that brings. We often hear people talk about building back better and building back greener. Certainly here in the UK, you know, these are well rehearsed terms, but delivering on them is somewhat different. So I guess that, you know, as engineers and planners, we know that it's a massive challenge to transform already kind of densely populated cities and cities with kind of established land use and established transport systems. And I suppose we also recognise that there are real concerns that, you know, some of these models for planning can, you know, they can do more harm than good. They can really alienate already marginalised communities. So any transformation really needs to take into account, you know, it needs to take all these things into account and be planned carefully, and maybe done in an evolutionary sort of manner. I mentioned digital earlier, and you know, one thing that we talk a lot about is a kind of triple access type model to developing 15-minute cities, where we're not just talking about kind of physical mobility and spatial proximity, but we're also talking about digital connectivity. And that's another reason why the pandemic has changed things a lot. People aren't just thinking about access to whatever it might be now, whether through, you know, the locality or that physical mobility, but digital connectivity. So that's something we could perhaps touch on at some point as well. So, you know, just to finish off, I mean, in the UK, you know, we're working, you know, on with several cities in terms of creating this 15 or 20-minute cities. We're doing this with Birmingham at the moment. And there's no doubt that, you know, that Birmingham's a good candidate. There are many things that it has in its favour, including quite a dense transport network, which certainly helps. But all of those challenges that I've talked about in the last sort of 2 or 3 minutes have absolutely come to the fore, you know, in terms of doing the consultation around Birmingham. So, you know, this isn't straightforward. It's complex and requires a deep understanding of the cities, the communities, the neighbourhoods that you're working with.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And just a quick thing, you know, you talked about density. And if you look at Birmingham or Paris or, you know, Melbourne, there's certainly critical density. Also, some of the cities traditionally were already organized around neighborhoods. But, you know, do you think you could transform, say, Los Angeles with very low density, such a spread, such a sprawl? Could it be transformed into a 15-minute walking city?
It's like I said, there's no blueprint, is there? I don't think there's any blueprint. You know,
But do you think it's possible? But do you think it's possible?
I think anything is possible as long as you recognise some of these key kind of goals around being careful that you promote equality and you don't actually generate inequality accidentally almost. So yes, I think you can do it, but I think you need to flex the model. You know, I was talking to someone about London recently and how London actually is a whole series of specialist centres, you know, the West End for media and the City of London for finance and so on. I think you need to sometimes work with what you've got rather than trying to impose what might feel like an ideal solution.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. And well, you know, Arunba, what about the global South? You know, your experience in India. How do you see the same concept being, you know, viable in the global South, and also more generally, you know, inequality can be a big issue. I'm thinking about some Indian cities. And so is it going to increase inequality if we think about cities with these kind of neighborhoods, then people stay mostly in the neighborhoods, but then, you know, the rich might stay more in one neighborhood and, you know, the poor in another one. So what's your take on it? Hello?
Thank you, Carlo. I hope you can hear me. And many thanks for having me on this panel. I think what you've touched upon is very important because ultimately, whether it's a 15-minute city or a 50-minute city, it really depends on how you bring that diversity into where you live, where you work, and where you go for entertainment. But one of the things that is common across the global south is the nature in which the urbanization is unfolding. Of course, if you look at, say, sub-Saharan Africa, you have about half the population which is urbanized. But if you look at Latin America, that number goes up to 85%. For South Asia, it's under 50% right now. So the question for us is, what is the kind of city and what is the kind of urbanization we will then adopt as we become more urbanized, right? And let's take transport for a second, because that's, I think, at the heart of bringing that equity question into city design. Again, in Africa, you have about 40 to 50% of transport is basically non-motorized, it's walking or cycling. In Latin America, again, it can be fairly high depending on how the city has been designed. But in Asia, where I reside, there are some parts of India, for instance, where 60% of urban trips are basically non-motorized. And yet developed Asia, like Singapore or South Korea, you have very low shares of non-motorized transport. So effectively what you're doing is the way you're designing a transport system can bring communities of different sort of income groups closer together or can widen the disparity. One more thing that matters here, I would say, in thinking this through is the actual kind of lack of capacity. I mean, if you take Australia and what Sally was talking about, you have about 20 odd town planners per 100,000 population. In a lot of the developing world, in Africa and Asia, that number could be as low as 5. So now what is the town planner doing? Is the town planner merely just kind of getting roads built out and buildings built out, or do you have the capacity to think about that integrated work, life, entertainment story along with equity at the heart of it? Another dimension that will be critical on the equity front will be how we deal with elements of the negative sort of environmental externalities. Whether you take air pollution, whether you take how waste is treated, whether you take how waste is disposed, whether you look at even indoor cooking fuels, these are things that the developed world perhaps does not have to deal with so much. But in the developing world, these have a big impact in the kinds of areas of the city that are more polluted than others, the kinds of population that are exposed to these negative externalities versus those who are living in greener enclaves. So I would simply say, if you focus on the transportation side, if you focused on building up the city planning capacity, and if we focused on mitigating those negative environmental externalities, then I think we can build 15-minute cities, but which are also more equitable than otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you, Aruna. There's a question from the audience I'm seeing here that I'd like to ask you. And, it's about how to remodel unplanned cities. And here I believe that the audience means, whoever asked the question means, informality. There's a lot of informality in the global south. So where do you start in that case?
I think that's a very important question, especially on the last issue I talked about waste, right? There's a huge informal waste management system in many cities of the developing world. Now, if you just overnight replace it with a so-called, top-down model, then you're actually effectively kicking out, tens of thousands of people out of employment and not necessarily guaranteeing a cost-optimal approach. Now, how do you bring that into your city planning? That goes to the heart of how you build a circular economy in the developing South, right?
Yeah.
So how does kind of more advanced technology for waste management integrate with a very labor-intensive waste collection system, right? Which does not exclude an entire part of the city or of the city's workforce.
Thank you.
I think again, it cannot be only an engineered solution. It has to be a lot more collaborative and consultative.
Thank you. Thank you. I would say somehow it seems to me you're saying you need to embrace informality and then from there try to upgrade and improve the city. We got a couple of minutes, still a couple of minutes. There's another question for the audience I'd like to ask. Maybe this can be shared between Mike and Sally. And the question is, what are the barriers to implementing the 15-minute city? And how can it be financed? And I wonder maybe, Mike, if you could comment just in 30 seconds on the barriers. You mentioned it before, but if in a nutshell, and then Sally, maybe on the financing of it. We've got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, I think that the barriers we've kind of talked about. I think you have to embrace the informality that we just discussed, and I think embrace the fact that there will be different solutions for different cities. I think, and Sally can talk about the detail of the financing, but financing is also kind of critical because clearly private sector investment is a big part of any city development, and certainly when you start looking at 15-minute cities, it's massively relevant. But you've got to be really careful that that investment isn't attracted into those places that are more advantaged, perhaps, than other places. So to try and get private sector investment into less advantaged areas is tricky. And then it also starts to be, as Dr. Dosh was talking about, the issues with how those transport links work, so that you can actually have cross-community transport links between the less less advantaged areas and the more advantaged areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Sally.
Yes. The financing can be very challenging because to have great 20-minute suburbs, the public realm and public infrastructure needs to be delivered and delivered well. The financing will normally come from usual levers, most of which start with a T, tax of some sort. We might call them developer contributions, for example. They could come from special purpose taxes set up for the infrastructure necessary to develop in certain areas, and it can come from general purpose taxes, depending on how we are budgeting here at Town Hall or at state government. What's really important, though, I'm picking up on some of Mike's comments, is a balance, because actually in taking that finance to deliver in the public realm, we also can't make it so expensive that private sector don't want to come in to deliver what is still essential pieces of those urban renewals and those 20-minute suburbs, private dwellings, commercial premises, employment zones, innovation zones, etc. So it's a really fine balance and something we're challenged with at the moment with 2 new urban renewal precincts we have within the city, but setting those suburbs up for success in the long term has to be the #1 priority.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Well, it's now time to wrap up and to close the section. Maybe I'll like to share some of the key takeaways for me. The first one is, there's not a single blueprint for the 15-minute city. Every city is different, and trying to implement a 15-minute approach in Melbourne, in Paris, in Birmingham, in Los Angeles, we really need to start from the local condition. The second thing that came up is infrastructure is key. So this is about waste, is about transport, is about bicycle lanes. 15 minutes, as we said a few times today, is about a 15-minute radius by walking or cycling. We also need to pay attention to some of the risks. Primarily, if you just live inside a 15-minute bubble, well, we got all the risks of bubble, in particular the social segregation and all what comes with that. But it seems to me that overall, there's a broad consensus that if we take the 15-minute neighborhood approach, well, they can help make our cities more livable and lovable. So I'll stop here, and please join me to thank all of our distinguished panelists, Sally Capp, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Mike Hague from Mott MacDonald, and Aruna Baghosh from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.